the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, and I'm a partnerships manager here at AllVoices, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Today, I'm excited to welcome our next guest onto the interview series, Natasha Kehimkar. She is the CEO and founder of Malida Advisors. Natasha, how's your day going?
It's going really well. Thank you, Christina. It's lovely to be here.
Yes, I'm so excited to speak with you. I enjoyed our pre-call so much and I want to dive into these questions. But first, if you could tell our audience a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, your role as CEO, and something that has recently brought you joy. This can be anything.
So my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am from Toronto originally, born and raised. I moved to the States for grad school, fell in love, and never left. I am CEO and founder of Malida Advisors, as you mentioned. We are a consulting firm. We provide HR and DEI consulting, as well as executive coaching and workshops and bespoke programs for companies. I've spent 25 plus years in people and talent. My mom was an HR person, and so was my father-in-law. So it runs in the family.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
You asked for something that I'm really proud of over the past little while. Brought me joy. Two things. One, I finally nailed bakery level challah, which has eluded me for years. And the second thing is I've spent the commute hours, what would have been my commute hours over the course of the past several months, talking to my parents and recording our family stories. These are stories I've heard many, many, many times over the years, but I recorded it this time. And there's something about being on video as opposed to in person that I think in some ways can be a little less inhibiting. And also, as I'm older, there are things that my parents, and specifically my mother, never really shared before that she shared now. And I've heard stories of my father's childhood that I didn't really fully comprehend until now. And it has been a really remarkable experience. And it's one that I hope to continue doing over the next several months. In fact, we're talking again this weekend.
Wow, that is absolutely incredible. And one of the more unique answers that I've kind of heard from this question as well. I'm also trying to call my family and my grandma more, but we're not recording the conversation. So I might take this as a nugget too, because the power of storytelling is very important. And you mentioned just running in the family in terms of the industry. How do you think your personal journey has really led you up until this point to really be a people leader and a diversity, equity, and inclusion leader as well?
Wow, there's a lot that goes into somebody forming who they are. For me, there are some early experiences that I had as a child being the only, where I was the only non-white child in my school for a long time. And I had certain experiences that I would say were life-shaping experiences, mostly not what one would look back and call positive, but for me, I take them as positive because they've made me who I am. Volunteering and social justice have always been a part of my community growing up, my school community, my home community. And also, we didn't grow up with a lot. And so going into to do a program, an undergraduate degree or a master's degree, being able to use that to get a job is actually really, really critical. So there was a necessity element as well. So I think it is those combination of things that pushed me to find a role that was going to be very practical, where I could apply what I was learning. But I think the other big piece for me, why people and talent, why DEI, I like solving problems. I like solving really complicated problems, and people are always surprising us. Much as there are studies and there are research and there are patterns that we can observe, we continue to be surprised by behavior, or maybe not surprised, but woken up by behavior. Our eyes are opened somehow. And that problem solving thread for me has always been really strong. And I find it's best applied in this space where I'm always on my toes.
Yeah, people are very complicated. So you are definitely correct in being in this space, and also want to acknowledge and thank you for sharing a little bit about your personal journey as well. I do think it's interesting to see where we were and how we got to where we are today. I think our stories are, again, really important. And one of the problems, or rather topics that people are discussing right now, whether you're in a virtual first, a hybrid, or a back in the office work environment, is psychological safety. And it's a term we're hearing a lot. And I just wanted to start with the foundation of, how do you define psychological safety, and what are key ingredients to really foster that environment, whether it's trainings, tools, and of course, everyone wants to know metrics.
Hmm. Well, I rely heavily on the work of Dr. Amy Edmondson. She's released a book called The Fearless Organization. And her definition is that psychological safety exists when people are willing to speak up, and they can do so without fear of retaliation. They believe that their voice is welcomed. There are other definitions and other elements to the definition as well. That it's an organizational climate that exists in a space where someone feels that they can share their perspective, that they are welcome to do so, that they're invited to do so. You talk about KPIs, so Dr. Edmondson actually has an assessment you can do, but I look at psychological safety as a core element of inclusive leadership. Our definition of leadership has to evolve to be very considerate of global environments, of people bringing their different perspectives to the table, inviting that in when we hire people, and encouraging it when they're present with us. I think these are critical elements, and there are KPIs associated with the model that Dr. Edmondson shares, and I would encourage people to definitely either read or listen to the book, because it is a very comprehensive story of what psychological safety can be, what its potential is. And it's not about saying whatever you want whenever you feel like it. Because and this is a common misconception, I think, of psychological safety, that it just means that my opinion is welcomed. And even if it's harsh, I get to say it. It's actually not accurate. It requires us to also consider what other people might be experiencing and feeling. And so if we just said whatever we wanted, we would be harming other people's psychological safety, right? So there is a balance in there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Amy Edmondson, we focus a lot on her work as well, because we believe in psychological safety, and she's one of our advisors as well, to make sure that we're creating that space for employees. And as you mentioned, words definitely matter, and we're not giving everyone like a blank check to say whatever they want, regardless of anyone else's feelings. And I found it interesting in our kind of discussion before this as well. One of the topics we really wanted to talk about was relationships in terms of people and HR teams, but specifically within relationships, the term gaslighting, right? It happens in all kinds of relationships, but I really want to kind of talk about this with teams, because if you're a new employee joining, or you're currently at a company and you don't have a relationship with the HR people team, there's maybe a hesitancy there. And the definition of gaslighting, just to level set, is to like either manipulate someone by psychological means into questioning their own sanity. How do you see this manifesting in the workplace when we start with like the HR people team kind of relationship?
Well, we've got a few elements that are baked into this concept, and gaslighting is something that we started to see more and more written about gaslighting last year
Mm-hmm.
with the protests and more conversation about racial gaslighting in particular.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I've observed over time that people teams do is perpetuate gaslighting. It's not necessarily that the people team is initiating it,
Right.
but it is enabling it. And this is one of the opportunities I think that people teams face right now. And that is really looking at things from a very balanced perspective. If there's an employee relations issue, or there's a complaint, or there's a comment about somebody's behavior, really look at the full context, understand what the situation is, like follow that STAR model. What was the situation? What was the task? What's the action? What's the result? Dig in that manner to really understand the dynamic that's going on in that part of the organization. And don't take one person's point of view as the only point of view or the full point of view. I think that's a pretty critical element, where we take a manager's perspective, and the manager says, I want to put the person on a PIP, and here's why. And they have a ton of reasons. But are we digging in sufficiently to understand the full dynamic that's going on? I would argue that often we don't. We don't. That much as the people and talent function wants to advocate for the company first, then for the employee and manager on balance, we still may tend towards supporting the manager more. And there's opportunity. And I don't mean that now we're employee advocates 100%. We are organization advocates. And what's best for the company is that taking that balanced point of view. With gaslighting, as people team members, often when an employee will come and have a conversation with us, we'll talk to them about their tone. We'll talk to them about how they land. Are we taking into consideration fully and on balance the situation that they're dealing with, their reaction, what they bring, the further context? That's where we have a really important role to play. That even when we're having one-on-one conversations and coaching conversations with people, are we digging in sufficiently ourselves? And I'm not talking about investigation now. I'm talking about just a conversation with someone to really hear the whole story. How active is our listening? Are we listening to the tone? Are we listening to the body language? There's more to listen to than just the words.
Absolutely. I definitely agree. There's never one side to a story. Context is really important, and active listening is a skill that you need to practice and be intentional about, and not just hear the person. And I also, another thing to point out about your response was just an organization includes both the managers, the people in HR team, but also employees. So holistic perspective is definitely what we want to see. And you brought up managers and leaders. And I think just in terms of positionality and power dynamics within an organization, it can be really tough to bring something up with your manager too. And I think that, you can recognize when a manager is also maybe initiating or kind of being gaslighty as well. And I think it's important for employees to recognize when this is happening. Could you provide like examples of this in regards to a manager and kind of a direct report or individual contributor?
The one that I hear most often is about tone.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually had an employee in an organization I work with explain to me what tone policing was.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a conversation about, well, how do you reconcile the anger and frustration that you're experiencing and how that's expressed with the person you're having a conversation with?
Mm-hmm.
And it actually veered into this conversation about psychological safety, that it's about establishing trust. It's about really listening. It's about being open-minded. It's about actively being present for the conversation and not bringing your stuff to a conversation with someone who had nothing to do with your stuff.
Right.
Right. And so I found that the best opportunities for me to explore what gaslighting, what psychological safety means when I was sort of co-exploring that with someone else. Mm-hmm. Where I could really understand what was their experience. Where would they wish to see support that they're not getting today? Asking those kinds of questions. If you had a magic wand and could change things, what would you change? What would you like to see? And it's a fine line, right? We don't want to put the burden on the person who's bringing the issue forward.
Sure.
So we have to walk a fine line as we do this. But maybe it's talking with a peer. Maybe it's talking with someone who's in the same kind of function as you are, but maybe not in your company. Maybe it's just talking to a friend or family member about it. But I think this idea of exploring how can we show up differently is really critical. And so I really push for people to read more about this, to understand what might be, explore back, look back at previous experiences you've had yourself. When I think back on that situation, the person had a very strong reaction to something, and the conversation was about how it landed. Mm-hmm. And the person was offended that they were being talked to about what had happened. At the core, do you not recognize the issue? There was some real validity to the core issue that was being raised, but the person felt that they were being attacked for the way they expressed it. And in fact, we had to balance the company values, the way we want to be treated, with what the person was bringing to the conversation themselves. And it was not an easy conversation, and it was not a short conversation. Yeah. And this is the thing, that we have to allow ourselves to get into that dialogue and to not make it one-sided, not cut it short too quickly. we shortchange the person, we shortchange ourselves in terms of our ability to learn when we do that. So there is an element of allowing enough space and time for us to digest these concepts that may be new, may be uncomfortable, maybe we've been avoiding.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I definitely agree that it is a continuous conversation. It's not just a one and done, check the box, and you just put a timer on it as well. It's something that continuously needs to be worked on. And to your point, we never want to put the onus on the employee that is experiencing a problem or is being vulnerable and sharing this. But sometimes it's hard to, especially from a manager and like team member perspective, to really, be in it. And I want to ask from the employee side, what can you do to react to this behavior? You touched on it a little bit, but I don't think we can overemphasize just the tools and kind of language you can use there to be helpful for the individual employee.
I strongly advocate open-ended questions. So we think we're good at asking open-ended questions and we're not. So asking what, how questions, not really why questions, because why questions can be very pointed, shall we say, right? They can really put the person on the spot. But we also can think about, are we getting names right? Are we finishing other people's sentences? Are we thinking in our heads about what we're going to say next instead of really listening to the question that's stated and the one that's not stated? These are things that are really critical. When we take a look at our engagement survey data, are we looking for other data points in our day-to-day interactions, or do we go heads down to do the analysis and then we pop up maybe to do some focus groups and then we get on with our day? Are we looking for data points as we have these conversations with people? And I think that the biggest thing we can do is focus on those open-ended questions. Really invite people to share. Acknowledging and validating. This is a coaching tool that I learned in my coaching program, and it's one that I think people confuse with saying someone's right. But acknowledging is acknowledging what the person is experiencing right now. I can see this is frustrating, or this has got to be pretty frustrating. Test that. Is it true? Maybe the person isn't frustrated. Maybe they're flat out angry.
Yeah.
Maybe they're hurt. So test that. Is this frustrating? I see a lot of emotion there. Is it frustration? Ask the question. And then validating, well, it's understandable or it's natural that you might feel this way, right? It doesn't mean it's right the way you reacted. It doesn't mean it's right or wrong, frankly, but it is an acknowledgement and it's a validation that it is okay to feel how you feel. So we've spent a lot of time, especially in the last few years, talking about bringing your whole self to work.
Sure.
My hypothesis is that most organizations want their folks to bring about 80% of themselves to work, because I'm not sure you really want to understand the politics or get into a big political discussion with me. I'm not sure you really want to understand my whole history and life story. I'm not sure you want all of that. And it's okay. Just don't put limits without explaining that, here's what we're looking for. Here's the conversation. Like, psychological safety matters. I want you in this moment to tell me what's going on. Tell me about your background so that I can understand why you might see things the way you see things. Make sure that you create the space, make it clear that there's space for that. But, when we say bring our whole selves to work and then we don't act like it's okay to do that, it shuts down conversation. And the biggest challenge you'll face is that folklore spreads throughout the company. And that story, that folklore, as I call it, it gets repeated. And what is perpetuated in your organization? Is it what you want?
Yeah, these are big questions to ask. And a lot of what we're talking about is having a dialogue, having a two-way conversation and effective communication, being transparent, being vulnerable, leading with empathy. And oftentimes, we were using examples of managers and people leaders, but executives and C-suite leaders definitely have a role to play in this as well. And oftentimes, especially at startups or fast-growing companies, CEOs often have an quote-unquote open door policy where they're like, you can knock on my virtual door or actual office door anytime, but nobody really leverages that. What does it really look like in practice to have a quote-unquote open door policy, and how can like executives really engage with folks and be kind of accessible?
So executives run into this challenge all the time. And I've been fortunate, most of the executives and most of the CEOs that I've worked with have been really brilliant and also really humble. And the biggest flaw they have is they forget their role.
Yeah.
So when I say that, I mean, they forget that they are the most senior person in the organization. They
Mhm.
forget that, maybe 3 years ago, they were one of the other folks in the room and they could just, collaborate and they would get into a big argument or conversation with someone. Maybe it really was an argument and everybody was okay afterwards. But when you're CEO, it's less okay. When you're chief product officer, it's less okay. Your title carries weight.
Mhm.
And so just by virtue of that, the dynamic and the magic that you bring is different. Whether you realize it or not, it's different. And so saying you have an open door policy, it signals the right signals, but in practice, we don't see many people taking leaders up on that option, particularly people from other functions crossing functional lines to have conversations with execs. It's not that common. There are a few things that I would recommend. First, assess, right? Have a survey of some sort where people can provide their perspectives, and that perspective is shared back, right? So that there's a feedback mechanism to teams, to departments, to functions, to geographies, so that it doesn't go into a black hole and people wonder, well, why'd you bother asking?
Yeah.
You've done 3 or 4 surveys and clearly it doesn't matter. So why bother? So I
Right.
think that there's a really important element there. I think skip level meetings are really good opportunities to connect with organizations. I
Mhm.
like for leaders that work with me to be very transparent about the fact that they're having skip level meetings. So don't surprise the managers who are reporting in, if you're a leader of leaders, to go and have conversations with their people without their knowledge. Make sure that you have an agreement with your people leaders to say, I'm having skip level meetings. I am not taking action. I will share themes. Like, what are you going to share back? Whatever it is, be upfront about it before you start having conversations with folks 1 level or 2 levels below. I think that it's an important element. I do think that having opportunities to connect and do ask me anything type questions or fireside chats with very small groups can be a really powerful way to connect with folks. And it can open the door for more open door, hey, can I have a quick chat types of opportunities. But you have to be present. And I don't mean physically present, particularly in our distributed world right now. And hopefully we see more of that in organizations going forward. You can do these in a virtual way, and it might take some practice and you might need some warm up, and that's okay. But inviting those opportunities to just, ask me whatever you want. And being okay to say and confident enough to say, that's a question that I can't answer at this time, but when I can, I will circle back with you.
Mhm.
Right? I think these are ways we can do that. The other piece is, and not to plug your organization, but I'm going to plug your organization, where you look for opportunities to have a constant open door, where there is a space of a safe space for employees to share their perspective and do it in a way that's inviting. Some of the older, more legacy tools for gathering complaints or whistleblower accounts or even suggestion boxes were pretty clinical, you know, and not clinical in a warm way, but clinical in a very harsh. Even the colors being harsh. It was very black, white, red. Like, you didn't fill in this field, and okay, make it a little bit more inviting. Use tools like the ones you offer at AllVoices to invite people to share their perspective. And then again, feed it back, share it back. There are opportunities here in these Ask Me Anything or fireside chat environments
Mhm.
with tools like AllVoices, with engagement surveys. You're getting information. You can get a lot of anecdotal information too, absolutely. But draw in people. Don't put up blocks and then say, oh, I have an open door.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that is really important. And also, in terms of what you mentioned, it sounds like a bunch of different strategies to really be intentional about communication and really just wanting that feedback as well. And I do think sometimes if you don't feed it back to people or you don't act on it or acknowledge the feedback that they give, you kind of lose the right to ask it, or they just stop giving it because they're like, it's going nowhere, like you said. Leadership is something that is really, I mean, when there's really great leadership, when there's, so-so or needs improvement
Yeah.
leadership. How do you think about measuring the effectiveness of whether it's a people leader or an executive through like KPIs when it is a little bit more intangible? What is your recommendation there?
I look for evidence of success or evidence of challenge, right? So we'll look at goals and literally like what are the objectives that the person has on their plate? Are they achieving them? How are they achieving them on their team? So it's not just them, it's their team. What then are the other facets that we look at? Are we looking at engagement survey results for that group? Are we looking at inclusion and belonging data for that group? Are we looking at attrition? Are we looking at promotion rates? Are we looking at performance ratings and the consistency of those ratings over time? These are things that come into play very heavily. What channels of communication are they using? What ways are they inviting input and incorporating input to innovate in their organizations and on their teams? One thing that I'll actually mention that refers back to the previous question you asked, Christina, was, often we'll have great leaders who will say, I'm going to tap into my team since people aren't coming to me directly. I'm going to tap into my team to bring feedback forward. Mm-hmm. And then when they do, what happens? They don't like what they hear. Yeah. And then what, right? Resistance starts to bubble up. And we see this with engagement survey data too. When people don't like the data they're seeing, people are resistant. So they start to question the methodology. So if it's a manager bringing feedback to a vice president or C-suite person, well, that was one person's perspective. How many other people feel that way? And that person's really new to the organization. All these reasons as to why the feedback can't be real or isn't valid. Mm-hmm. Let's just stop for a moment. Let's just take a moment, breathe, and be objective. Step back and think, how would you coach somebody who is faced with this? Would you coach them to be resistant? Or would you coach them to just listen at first and then dig in, listen to the whole thing, process it, come back, revisit, come back and discuss it further? So there are some things that organizations can do. And I think to the extent that leaders are doing those things, demonstrating these behaviors, that's where we see stronger executives, stronger leaders. We tend to see that their careers are moving in more positive directions. We tend to see their teams are flourishing. We see maybe less attrition, or if people leave the company, they leave on very good terms, and you may see boomerangs coming back, right? Or they attribute their success to their experience with that organization, with that leader. And so when you do podcasts like these, who are people mentioning? Who are the names that are being named?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I love that answer. And I think it goes to the common thread or theme in our conversation of asking questions, asking specific and intentional questions, whether that's internal and reflection of yourself as a leader or an individual contributor, and also externally to others to have that two-way conversation as well. And it's a dynamic process. Everything is always changing. We're talking about feedback and constructive feedback. You might be afraid to get that feedback or give it if you are a new employee and you're coming in and you can have the best culture in the world somewhere, but you're bringing in that external experience of, oh, I might be retaliated against or whatever the experience may be. What are your thoughts around what kind of feedback should be anonymous or non-anonymous? Do you think that there is a need for kind of both?
Yes. I think when it comes to gathering feedback, we have to offer different tools, right? So we do offer those AMAs, those Ask Me Anything sessions. So the face-to-face or voice-to-voice or on Zoom or whatever tool you use, that there is an opportunity to talk to a human being. Mm-hmm. I think there's also real benefit to offering and maybe even asking the same questions online.
Yeah.
Right. Where it is a little bit more, maybe not anonymous, but maybe confidential. Mm-hmm. Right. There is a difference between anonymous and confidential, that we are studying what that means and that we're clear about that when we are offering up these tools to our organizations. I think the other piece that we need to see, though, is composure, right? That executives are demonstrating a level of composure when they're faced with real challenge, that there's a recognition that I'm starting my meeting at 9 a.m. You're coming in at noon. Your questions are going to be different than where my head is at, and I'm stunned. Remember the context.
Yeah.
So as we offer these tools, both in person or voice to voice and online, that we are demonstrating that composure, that we are demonstrating a willingness to really hear what people are sharing, understand why, and don't ignore it. Now, you may choose not to act on it, but this is part of the feedback mechanism that I would say is most critical, and that's closing the loop. Right? Circle back with what the feedback is and what you're going to do about it. And if you're not going to do something about it, why not? And it's okay to say, I'm not going to do something about it sometimes, but the context matters. The why not matters a lot.
Yeah, I think closing the loop is really important in any conversation. And if you are putting yourself out there as someone who's giving the feedback, just making sure that you are seen and heard and listened to is important by the other person. And along the same lines of feedback, this could be recent or just something that sticks out in your mind. But I think it's interesting when I ask folks, what is the best and maybe worst or not so great piece of feedback you've ever given or received?
Wow. I think the best piece of feedback I got was from a former leader of mine. His name was Peter Wentworth. We worked together for quite some time, and he became a mentor, maybe unbeknownst to him. But Peter once told me that I didn't present the way others presented. I presented the business update first and then the functional update. So the HR update was second. And in this organization, the HR function reported first to the business leaders, the line leaders, and then dotted line to HR. And so I took it as a huge compliment, and he encouraged me to continue doing it because it really establishes us as HR leaders, as business leaders first. HR happens to be the function that I'm leading. And so that was a terrific piece of feedback because he showed how I could really continue using that and keep getting stronger as a result. So I loved and so appreciated that piece of feedback. There's a lot I've forgotten over the years. I won't ever forget that. The worst piece of feedback that I got, it was, well, you're Indian and this person's Indian, but you don't behave like the Indian people that they grew up with. And so maybe you should consider being a little bit more on the side. And they don't like you being in front, and they don't like you. And there was a list.
Oh my God.
And, it's harsh. It was hard. I admit in the moment, I was stunned. I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say.
Shocking. Yeah.
It was shocking. It wasn't the first time I had been, told that I'm not what people expect. But the fact that my identity was brought in to part of that conversation was really difficult. It's a difficult pill to swallow.
Well, that is definitely unacceptable. The best piece of feedback, I'm glad that you remember it 10 years. That's a testament to that. And thank you for being vulnerable and sharing your worst piece of feedback as well. In terms of kind of macro level trends in the people and DEI space, is there anything that you think leaders or companies in general should focus on in order to be successful and keep up with the progress that's being made right now?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest opportunities we have when we look at DEI and people and talent is to not separate DEI out. When we look at diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging from an organization effectiveness perspective, we see the whole system, right? When we think about DEI being separate, which is unfortunately what most organizations do, we overlook the opportunity to embed DEI into the DNA of an organization. So the biggest compliment I've ever gotten from someone was when I told them what I was doing with Malida Advisors. He said, I feel like you were working on DEI before it was an acronym. And on the one hand, I was really flattered. On the other, I kind of felt a little old, but but the fact that it was just part of how I did things was exactly what I wanted.
Yeah.
And I don't want, when I leave an organization, or I never wanted when I left an organization, that DEI bias would go with me.
Sure.
It should stay, right? It should be part of the company, not me. And so I really encourage organizations to think much more holistically about DEI, embed it, make it ingrained in your processes, in the way you do business, your supplier diversity. So how you interact with the community around you,
Mhm.
uh, your talent acquisition process, of course, that's the go-to for a lot of people. But
Yeah.
when you assess and you're assessing performance, what are you basing that on? When you talk about leadership and inclusive leaders, how do you assess inclusive leadership? Are we still using the old ways of assessing leadership, or are we including DEI? And there's a great book that came from Korn Ferry, and it's called The 5 Disciplines of Inclusive Leaders.
Oh, amazing.
It's got a great model, and it's research-based across geographies, across industries, and thousands of people have participated in the studies that led up to this book. There are data now that explain to us what inclusive leadership is.
Mhm.
Again, organization effectiveness, taking that holistic perspective to DEI and not making it parsed out or separate.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is really, really important because it's not only unrealistic, but I think that's a lot to shoulder as one person, whether you are consulting with a company, whether you're the chief diversity officer or program manager, you cannot be the only one responsible for making an organization equitable and making sure that everybody is thinking about it. It is everyone's responsibility and job, and people should want to be motivated to do that as well. One of the questions that I think about too is when you're thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion roles, and we're seeing a lot of these pop up right now, do you think this should be a function underneath or housed within HR people, or if this should be something that is separate and you're just working with different functions of the organization? I've seen it done a couple different ways, but wanted to know your thoughts on that.
I actually think that there should be DEI functions in multiple parts of the organization.
Oh, that's a good answer.
So I participated in a webinar some time ago where I think I was the only one who was okay with DEI sitting with HR. And that's because I think until the processes have DEI embedded in them, you need the voice, you need the someone bringing the expertise and the ideas and the creativity and the willingness to educate their peers
Right.
on DEI core principles until the function embeds it further. And there are data that show that HR people tend to be a little uncomfortable with DEI, don't know where to start. Josh Bersin did release some research, I think it was end of last year, beginning of this year, about that very issue. And so there is a space for DEI within the people function. That said, when DEI only sits with the people function, we lack opportunity to pay attention to who our customers are. We neglect the opportunity to think about our community and the investment in our community that we could make, right? And so that's why I think we ought to consider some DEI expertise in different parts of the business. It's a way to seed the knowledge, seed the expertise, and have the education come from your own function rather than some formal corporate body,
Sure.
right? On how to think about inclusion, how to think about diversity and representation, that we think about equity all the time, that is just part of who the company is. And it's not an afterthought. So the danger, I think, of having a DEI, like a chief diversity officer who sits under the reports into the CEO and doesn't have ties into the other organizations, or just sits within HR, I don't think either one of them is actually ideal.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is important to embed it in all of the processes. And I think if you're a hiring manager, if you are, an engineer, you all have different aspects of the business and everybody. And I think you mentioned this earlier too, in terms of vendors, suppliers, the people you're interacting with, it's all one in a holistic strategy in order to make sure that you're still fostering an environment of inclusivity and belonging, which needs to be meaningful as well. I know that our conversation has spanned the gamut from your personal journey to just what you've seen in the kind of people and DEI space as well. But if by any chance, is there anything that I didn't ask you that you want to kind of share with the audience before we close out our conversation, or one or two key insights that you hope they take away after listening in?
I think the one piece of advice I might share is always be learning.
Mhm.
So be a voracious reader. Explore ideas that you're unfamiliar with or a little uncomfortable with. Expand your horizons that way. Continue to read, continue to study, ask questions, and be curious. Um, and go in too. So I like to say people have a backpack. We all carry a backpack. I can't see mine. You can see it. You can see it in the way I act and the way I behave. But unless I know what's in my backpack, I may be bringing out the wrong tools at the wrong time, right?
Absolutely.
But if I do the inner work, if I spend time understanding myself and always am learning, I'm always reading and I'm always curious to expand my perspective, I gain self-awareness as well. And for example, I did my coaching accreditation because I wanted to be a better person.
Mhm.
And I think I am. I think I learned a lot about myself and what I've been bringing all these years because I did that work. And it wasn't easy. And I'm really glad I did it. And I just encourage everyone to just always be learning.
Always be learning, a forever student. I think that also relates to being an effective communicator is also communication with yourself and reflecting, having that self-awareness, can never take that for granted. Natasha, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture. It was a true pleasure to speak with you this afternoon.
Thank you so much. It was an honor.
Yes, and as a reminder for folks who are listening, All Voices believes in the empowerment of everyone to speak up in an organization, and we think it's a requirement for the company to succeed. We'll speak soon.